So we're now going to talk about where qualitative data comes from, some of the sources and methods that are used to produce qualitative data. And we're going to begin with existing qualitative data. There's a great deal of qualitative data that already exists in the world. It's sometimes also called secondary qualitative data because it exists or it was produced originally for some other purpose and it's used as research data in a kind of secondary way. There's a great deal of it out there. A good example is archival or other written documents. There are national archives, administrative archives. Most organizations archive their records, their testimony, minutes from meetings. There's laws, regulations, legislative debates, strategic plans, correspondence. And that kind of material, which is collected as part of, political or administrative activity, is a rich source of information that researchers often turn to understand policies and programs and social affairs. Another source of existing qualitative data, a huge source these days, is the internet and the masses of popular media and visual media culture that's produced all around the world. So this includes things like photos, videos, magazines, newspapers, TV, movies, blogs, web pages, and social media. Increasingly, researchers have begun to use some of the existing data on social media sites as a kind of insight into culture and society. So there's a great deal of that, and in our book, we give an example of 911 calls that were tape recorded and used to kind of analyze the guilt or innocence of the caller who is reporting a crime. And so let me just point out. So I'm going to cover these topics, the different sources and methods of qualitative data, in a kind of overview fashion. But I do want to emphasize that there's much more information in the book, and then you should read that carefully, as well as look at the examples, such as the 911 calls. Look at those examples in the book carefully, because they're good illustrations of how these methods actually appear in policy and social research. So there's obviously original qualitative data as well, and most of that, or a lot of that, often comes from interviewing people. So qualitative interviews are perhaps the most widely used form of collecting qualitative data. When you hear about qualitative research or a qualitative study, often that will be an interview study. And this is a kind of unstructured interview, or at least semi-structured interview. It's not the kind of check-the-box interview that is typical of surveys, which are a form of quantitative research, which we'll talk about in a couple weeks. But what we mean here is interviews in a more journalistic or open-ended style. And but still within that, there are two broad types. There are wholly or completely unstructured interviews, and then there are semi-structured interviews. Unstructured interviews tend to take place over multiple occasions. There's no predetermined script or any kind of set questions in advance. Typically, the researcher spends a lot of time in a setting and interviews people with a objective and a broad research question in mind. But the actual interview takes place in a more fluid, maybe even improvisational kind of way. And that contrasts with semi-structured interviews, which are, again, they're open-ended questions, but there's a semi-structured series of topics that the interviewer goes through. And this kind of semi-structured interviewing is much more common in applied research, where they tend to take maybe anywhere from as short as 30 minutes, maybe as long as 2 hours. And they're typically recorded, audio recorded in some way. There's a set of maybe 10 to 20 open-ended questions that the interviewer tries to cover, and essentially the same broad topics are covered with the 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 people that are interviewed as part of the study, and that produces the data, the qualitative data that then is analyzed in ways we'll look at shortly. Another really widely used method of qualitative research, particularly in applied policy research, is the focus group interview. It's sometimes called a focus group method or focus groups for short, but it's also a kind of interview, but it's an interview of a group of people in which there's a moderator who's in some ways the interviewer, and typically 6 to 12 participants sitting around usually a table, sort of a oval or circular table, or a conference table, a typical conference table, and the moderator asks the questions and guides the discussion. And now the reason they're quite popular is that focus groups have a different sort of feel and dynamic to them than individual interviews. First of all, you can interview more people at one time in a focus group. So you could, in 1 2-hour session, let's say, you can hear from 10 to 12 people instead of just one person. So you have that sort of broader sample of people that you're hearing from. But also importantly, focus groups have a kind of social dynamic to them that makes them very useful. So participants cue each other. They give each other cues and ideas. It's sort of like the dynamic of a brainstorming session where someone can suggest something, and that suggests gets another person talking, and you can really get sometimes a more dynamic and lively and insightful discussion going than you might in a one-on-one qualitative interview. And also, because it's a group of people that you're listening to and observing, you can get a sense of the generalizability of what's being said. In other words, you can tell, if it's one person and their opinion, and other people are shaking their heads and not agreeing, or is there a lot of consensus around the table? So a focus group allows whatever's being said during the interview. It allows the researcher to observe the generalizability of that. How broadly held is that? And in fact, sometimes the moderator even asks that question directly. How many of you, I see a lot of you shaking your heads. How many of you agree with that, or how many of you have had that similar experience, and so on. So it has that advantage, and it also tends to mimic it's a social setting, right? The focus group is a group setting, and so it tends to mimic social processes of thinking. In other words, it mimics the way in which people influence each other, and that can be useful depending on the topic. It can also be a hindrance if it's a sensitive topic or something that people don't want to talk, a socially, let's say, undesirable or socially embarrassing topic. You wouldn't want to cover that in a focus group because people may not be honest. So it's not good for every topic, but for some topics it's quite lively and quite insightful. Here's just a snapshot from the book of a typical focus group setting. It's a little stylized diagram, but you can see the arrangement of people around a table. The moderator sits at the end of the table, typically tries to encourage and distribute the discussion, call on people who are quiet, and perhaps sort of monitor or regulate people who may be dominating the discussion too much. Often there's an assistant moderator, either off to the side or perhaps somewhere else in the room, who's observing and cooperating with the moderator. Sometimes the assistant moderator at the end of the focus group will ask his or her own questions because they've been listening the whole time and they may catch things that the moderator misses. Often you have to feed people. Focus groups take a couple hours typically, and people appreciate a little food and refreshment. And in many commercial focus groups facilities, and in policy research as well, it's useful to have an unobtrusive way to observe the focus group. There may be or stakeholders or members of a community and so on. Another source of qualitative data is observation. So sometimes interviewing is asking questions of people, but often observation alone, without asking people questions, can reveal a lot and can suggest insights. So We may want to observe a health clinic, or observe a neighborhood, or observe a classroom setting and what's happening in the classroom. So sometimes just sitting in a social setting and observing it unobtrusively is a useful source of information. And we give the example. Again, take a look at the textbook and read about these methods on your own carefully. But of an interesting study of injection drug users and that used a videotape observation. So observations can be videotaped as well. So that leads to another kind of observation method, which is sometimes called participant observation, or also ethnography. And that's when the researcher joins a setting, both to observe and to interact and to interview people. It's a very intensive form of qualitative data collection. Sometimes people spend weeks, months, even years in a setting to observe a community or an organization or a group of some kind. It's a form of qualitative research often associated with anthropology and some forms of sociology. And an example we give in the book, which again you should take a look at, is a study of homeless people in Chicago, which looked at the interesting question of why some homeless people refuse some of the social services that are available to. Okay, the final method of collecting qualitative data we're going to look at is the case study method, or case study research, which is a very important form of qualitative research. Now, what is a case study? It's not, case study methods are not a particular method in the sense of a qualitative interview being a particular method, or a focus group being a particular method. Rather, a case study is defined more by an in-depth look at a single complex case, such as an organization, an agency, maybe an office, a neighborhood, a precinct, or even a whole nation state. So it's defined more by an in-depth look at a particular unit or case, and then and typically there may be only one case that's examined in depth, or at most a couple cases. So the selection of the case is a very important consideration. So sometimes, again, we say more about all of this in the book, but sometimes cases are selected because they're paradigmatic, meaning they represent a particular kind of example of something that we're interested in. We could pick extreme cases, like particularly successful organizations or particularly unsuccessful organization, a school, let's say, or it could be a critical case, a case that's somehow critical in another way, not just based on its success, but and we give the example in the book of a gun violence, the implementation of a gun violence act in Maryland as an in-depth case study. Now, case study research is often comparative. For example, we may compare two organizations or two neighborhoods or two schools. Let's say a successful school and an unsuccessful school, for example. So we may select the cases to set up an analytical comparison. And that's sometimes referred to as comparative case study research. And comparative case study research can involve more than two cases. It could involve 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7, 10 maybe, but they're not too much more than that, because in some ways the fact that it needs to be an in-depth case study by definition, kind of limits how many cases can be examined, even in a comparative study. But having the ability to make comparisons is very important and provides a lot of leverage. So often case studies are comparative.